Hello, everybody, and welcome again to another episode of the Long Cast on the Lucas Heyde podcast. It is episode 5, and today we are going over study tips that I do and note-taking. I've just had my orange juice. I'm all hyped up on all the sugar that comes from it, and just before you guys get on me, because I know my friends will get on me about this, it is not the orange juice that you go out and buy from the store or anything. It's freshly squeezed orange juice, so it's better than that. There's not extra sugar in it or anything. Generally, I like to eat my fruits, but I don't usually eat that many fruits anyway. But just a little of it is a little treat that I have at night. Sometimes I like to have my freshly squeezed orange juice, and it's delicious. And all right, so now that I've had that, I'm all hopped up on my fructose. I'm all good to go. And so it's getting that time of year, and I didn't even realize it until like last week when I finished all of my hard schoolwork. I had a couple exams, I had a couple papers I had to do, and then I looked at the calendar and I was like, oh my gosh, finals week is in like 2 weeks. What am I going to do? So I think this is the perfect time to put this out. I want to talk about just things that I do that help me study effectively and optimally and not waste time. And I'm not always the best student, I'm going to be honest, but when I do well at my classes, papers, whatever it is, these are the reasons that I do well. And when I do succeed and perform my best in school and I really put my mind to it, these are the things that help me study effectively and optimally. And then at the end, I'm just going to go over how I take notes, because I think that fits in really, really well with how I study effectively, is actually how I took my notes, and then when I go back to read over them, how effective it is. And again, so you'll see that when it gets to studying, for me, it's mainly just minimizing my ability to get distracted by what's happening around me. So the environment is a really big part just for me. I know that I have a hard time focusing on studying sometimes, so it can be difficult. This is because generally the way I like to work on things is I see where my productivity is best that day, and then I move forward from there and try and apply myself the best way I can in the moment. So some days I'll study really effectively. Some days I'll get 5 pages done in a paper. I'll write a whole paper in a day, no problem. Other days it's just not there, and I want to do other things like work on the podcast specifically or do more physical fitness things, read those things. So it can be a bit difficult with studying because you don't really have the ability to do that. You have to take the time to dedicate and focus on one specific topic, even if you aren't necessarily in the mindset to focus on that topic. So I think it'll help a lot of people if you are like me and you tend to be all over the place with certain aspects of studying or whatever it is, especially if you're in college. I think this applies more to that because that is what I struggle with personally. So that's where it comes to minimizing my distractions, so that I don't get distracted and off topic and I focus properly. And then the rest is just willpower for me, honestly, is just the ability to not allow myself to get distracted by certain things once I've minimized the environment around me. All right, so let's move into it. To start off, I need to find a place to study because, again, the environment is so important, where I can get my work done that is the most effective. Things that I ask myself when it comes to finding a place to study is, the first thing I ask myself is, do I need a computer or can I use printed physical materials instead? This is because I don't have a laptop. I have my own desktop that I built, and I don't have a lot of space at that because I use a Veridesk. And while I love the component of the Veridesk that I can stand up and down and sit whenever I need to and get in different positions throughout the day, I don't find that it is very effective for space management if I need to have a lot of papers out, because I have 2 monitors, that takes up a lot of space. The keyboard takes up a lot of space. And there's just not a lot of space left for when it comes to the papers that I need if I'm using physical, actual study materials. So that is the first question I ask myself is, do I need to use my computer, or can I get away from that instead and unplug for a little bit? If I don't need my computer, then I look for a place that has a lot of space. This is because personally, I like to lay out all of my papers that I need so I can see everything at once. And then as I move forward, I tend to move chronologically from the least or from the farthest point in whatever the topic was to then the most recent point. Sometimes I will then work backwards if I feel like I haven't covered it properly. And once I have seen where everything falls in chronologically, have it all out in front of me, I can then remove the things in time as I get better at them. So I'll study, go over them, and then I will remove certain, for example, I'll have all the sheets of paper laid out. I'll then have the book laid out next to all those papers. So I do need a lot of space. And then over time, I'll remove the papers that I feel like I've covered amply. And then, for example, I usually take up an entire coffee table in my house, and I'll sit on the floor so I can see all the papers. And if I can't find a space, I honestly, there's been times where I just sit on the floor and I just lay out all my papers anyway. If I want a change of scenery, because sometimes it can get a little bit dull to study in the same exact place every single time, but again, I don't need my computer, I need the space, I'll go to the library at my school. I believe that this is effective because it is a place where everyone else is also studying, and I find that I feed off that a little bit if I am in an area where everybody is also trying to achieve the same goal that I am, and that is to get good grades and study and be effective, or most of the people that are there are doing that. I will do that, and I always pick the quiet fours because, again, I want to minimize the distractions of necessarily people talking around me. And generally, I will not study with other people. If I do, I make sure that I'll ask them, do you have something else to study too as well? Because otherwise I will just get caught talking to them instead, because I really enjoy talking. And conversations tend to interest me more than the topic that I'm studying at hand. It's also very hard to get myself motivated if someone else is sitting there and they're not motivated as well. So I generally try to study by myself, unless they're also studying as well. The quiet floors also help with this, because if I start talking really loud, it might get you a couple bad looks for being really loud. And just some points on this. I read an article called How Surroundings Affect Students' Learning that referenced some studies, and I want to highlight really quick that it referenced some studies, but I did not... I couldn't actually find the study. The link didn't load, and I don't know if it was my computer, my phone, or whatever, but I couldn't find the actual study. But there were some interesting points, and I just wanted to talk about it really quick because I think it applies to me as well. So I think it is still useful to point these things out. The article pointed out that students' productivity is influenced by everything from cleanliness of the environment to having the right amount of supplies. It also states that students should have around 2 to 4 feet of space so that they are uncrowded and able to get their work done. And this is something that I think is very prevalent for me. And again, since I don't have that actual study in front of me, and I can't actually look at the data, I don't know what age group this was studied on or whatever, but I weigh this against myself, these little tips here. So I know that when I go back to the coffee table example of me laying all my papers out on the coffee table, I definitely need around that 2 to 4 feet of space. So one thing to consider when you start studying is, do you have the right amount of space to do it? And then cleanliness of the environment is just, that's for me a no-brainer. If I have everything cluttered in front of me, that's going to be extremely distracting, and I feel that it takes up mental space and visual space that I don't need to be focusing on. And there's actually a really good book on this, The Art of Cleaning, I believe it is. I will correct myself in the show notes if I'm wrong about the title. If it's actually in my room, but it talks about how once you clean properly and you have everything cleaned, you will be able to do things in your life more effectively because you're not using cleaning as a distraction. So sometimes what people do is they will sit down to do paper and they'll actually end up just cleaning things in general because there's so much space taken up focusing on things that are distracting them instead. And it's a way of procrastinating, actually. Cleaning can be a way of procrastinating. So I make sure to keep things clean, and that way my environment doesn't distract me. Once I have the place that I'm studying in all set, I make sure to do a couple more things before I start focusing on the topic that I have to study. So again, this is all laying out just what I need to get done in order to study productively. I'm not even at the point where I study yet. The first thing I do is, if I'm not at my computer, I will put my phone in airplane mode. That is a general tip that I try to keep throughout the day anyway, especially if it goes in my pocket or anything else. That's because I don't want it to, first off, get all the signals and everything, and then notifications are the biggest thing. If I start getting a lot of notifications, I will absolutely get distracted and not be focused on what I have to do. So the first thing I'll do is I'll put my phone in airplane mode if I want to study the most effectively that I can, if I'm really motivated to study well. If I am at my computer, it is much harder, and I find that this is a willpower issue instead. That is because it is much easier if I am studying, say, in a web browser, to then just open up Facebook and get distracted by something like that. And so that is just more of a willpower issue. I'm not sure if there are apps or anything that would prevent that, but I also find that it's good to practice that and force myself to focus on the task at hand. And honestly, as I've gotten older and as I've practiced studying more effectively, I've gotten much better at that. And again, if I do start looking at social media or anything, I start to lose my focus, and it's hard for me to come back. That is the main issue, is that I personally cannot look at something else when I'm studying and then come back to what I was studying. I will generally get sucked in for about maybe an hour or even more if I pull something else up. Say if I pull up a TV show, I can't really have that on in the background, especially if it's one I haven't watched. And you'll see later on I will bring in movie examples. Sometimes I put on movies when I study, but that's different, and I will parse that down later and break it down later and unpack it. All right. I will then, if I'm not at my computer, I'll pick my music. Generally, I make sure to download the music I'm going to listen to beforehand, because again, I want to put my phone in airplane mode. I don't want to have to use anything else, and then have notifications going off. And this one thing that I do, I think I've heard several other people do this, is I will just listen to the same music over and over again. I'll listen to the same songs over and over again. This helps me, I feel, to get into this flow state where things just sort of go through my head and get me into the zone. And actually, while I'm writing the notes for this podcast, or was writing the notes for this podcast, I was actually doing that. I was listening to let me see, I have it right down here. It is a beat by Distinct, beats.com, I believe, with a Y. I'll put that in the description though. But it is just a beat, basically. There is no it is nice to listen to, but it is not distracting. So one caveat when I'm picking the music that I use to study is that for me personally, I will not pick music with lots of singing or rapping, because then what I tend to do is I then tend to focus on the actual words of the song and not what I'm doing in the moment. And I find that it pulls me away from the things that I have to focus on. So I listen to lots of video game music, piano, or classical music. All of these things are calming to me. I also find that they help me get into this flow state much better than, say, rap music or anything like this. I'll use those. I will save those that type of music for, say, if I'm working out or something, and to get me pumped up or something. But not while I'm studying. It tends to distract me. And so you'll see I'll just pick what I've been listening to recently was the Kingdom original soundtrack. It's basically just 40 minutes, and I just put it on repeat and I listen to it over and over again, and there's no words or anything, and it's just really calming, and I find that it really helps me achieve this flow state. But again, I don't go with words generally. I just pick either a song that I can just listen to and enjoy, that is calming, but again, that doesn't distract me. This is also the only time, depending on the song, I like to listen to my music very loud. Generally, I don't want to listen to my music very loud. I don't want to hurt my ears or anything. But when it comes to studying or being productive, I essentially want to drown out everything else and focus solely on the topic at hand. If people start talking to me, that will absolutely distract me. So I will listen to my music extremely loud, and that way I can then just focus on that. And usually I listen on my earbuds, which I don't know if I talked about them in the travel episode, which is these anti-EMF earbuds. I really like them if I'm studying on my phone, but when it comes to my computer, I will listen on a pair of Sente Arches gaming headsets. They have a built-in subwoofer on them, and I listen extremely loud. It tickles my ears a little bit. I really enjoy it. The sound quality is nice, and they weren't that expensive. I got them on sale. They were like $40. They're amazing. And even if I hear something like pots and pans banging in the kitchen, because my computer is downstairs near the kitchen, I will get extremely distracted and then go and want to be in the kitchen and talk to everybody and see what's going on in there. That is generally it for when it comes to the environment, picking my music and everything. If it's something like writing a paper, I know Tim Ferriss really enjoys this. He's talked about it multiple times. When he's writing his book, I will put on a movie in the background. And it really depends on the movie that you choose. But for me, I will generally put on Pumping Iron because I've watched this hundreds of times. I watch it every day. And the reason I think that this works is because it's something that my mind can kind of fill in the empty space that happens in possibly in between thoughts or everything else that might be distracting me, but it doesn't necessarily require my attention. This is because I already know every scene and every line, so I don't really need to watch the movie, but it's kind of just there as kind of background noise. And I don't want, say, a movie that I've seen before or a TV show or that I haven't seen before or a TV show that I haven't seen before to be on, obviously, because then I will rather watch that than study. But I find that something like Pumping Iron for me on in the background really helps me focus. And from there, I want to then move on to how I actually take my notes to then get me to study. So the things that I find that help me memorize easier or the most effective way for me to take notes. Generally, when I study, I prefer paper notes. Again, this is mainly a space issue. Just having the physical, actual paper notes in my hand and then being able to spread them out instead of having it on some sort of electronic device. I also find reading paper. I actually print out my notes right here. I'll type out my notes online for my podcast, but I will then print out the notes to then read. I find it much more tedious, and I just can't seem to focus as well when I read my notes off of a device of some sort. But I'll talk about it later, but I'll use something like a Rocket Book. I'll briefly touch on all these ways that I take notes that I find are extremely effective. Excuse me. And for something like journaling in my bedroom, I'll use a good old pen and paper. I like to use regular college ruled notebooks when it comes to something like this. I like the structure of the line to line when it comes to writing journals and taking my food notes, but it's a bit different for when it comes to school. So I want to touch on that difference real quick. If I'm stuck with pen and paper for taking school notes, generally I don't like to do that, but if I do, I use blank sheets of paper with no lines on it at all. There's several reasons for this. From a waste standpoint, I don't like to go out and buy a notebook for individual classes. I always had the same ritual that a lot of people had. Whenever the semester started, I would always go to Staples, Target, wherever. I'd bring my class schedule with me, count out all of my classes. I would then go get a binder, notebook for each individual class. For me, this is just, I find as ineffective as anything. First off, I'll admit a whole new binder for each class makes no sense because I could just reuse the binders from previous semesters, but it was just some sort of ritual that I guess has been ingrained, that was ingrained into my brain, and then I would just do it every single time instead of reusing them. And for notebooks, I can't tell you the last time I brought a notebook for a school class and filled out the whole thing. I don't think it's ever happened. Unlike my daily logs with my notebooks, I know I'm going to get to the end eventually and have to get a new one. A little dream of mine actually is just have a huge stack of notebooks I've collected over the years. It's a little off topic, but that's the only time I like to have lines in my notebooks necessarily. Another reason I really like the blank sheets of paper is I feel it gives me space to draw arrows, find and fit little extra notes in and mark certain things that are important. And again, it's more of just a mental thing for my head to I feel I have this blank sheet of paper to work with. And I feel like I have a little bit more freedom and space than if I was not using a blank sheet of paper. And that's why I like the loose leaf printer sheets, but it does have its downsides. Again, I'm not sure if it is actually more cost effective than a notebook. I haven't actually sat down and calculated out sheet to sheet. So if it is less cost effective, I want to avoid using the printer paper if I can. Another reason reason the blank printer sheets have a downside is storage. Since I stopped using binders, I honestly don't want to go out and hole punch every single one of my blank printer sheet notes or whatever, and then have to organize them. And if you're like me, they can get really, really cluttered in my bag and disorganized, and which is not optimal by any means. So I'll take a bunch of notes, and if they're not in a notebook or something, they can definitely get lost. And that is extremely frustrating because I really like to go back and look over my notes no matter what it is. And so this then brings me to the Rocketbook. And then I will finish off with how I take notes electronically. But the Rocketbook is actually something I heard from Tim Ferriss, and is something that I really enjoy. Right off the bat, what I enjoy about it is that it looks like blank sheets of paper with just some dots on it. There's no lines or anything. It gives my head that same feel and freedom of a blank sheet of paper. But the nice thing about the Rocketbook is that it is very thin. It has about 30 some pages, and it is reusable. So the way it works is you can actually wash and wipe down the paper once you've used it, if you use the correct pen. And that's why I really like it. They have also one that you can hair dry or microwave to get rid of all the ink on the paper. There's a special friction pen you have to use, I believe. It's friction with an X, I believe. And I really enjoy that. I find that it is perfect for school because basically what I'll do is I will take my notes normally that I would on a blank sheet of printer paper, and then I will just X out where it fits it in my notes. I will then take a picture with my phone. It will scan it. It will pull up everything that I wrote. And after that, it will upload it to something like Evernote. And I really enjoy that. I find it's really effective, and it's about $30, and I've already gotten way more use out of it than I thought I would originally. Originally, I just got it to test it out, and I found that it really works for me, and it's perfect for school because if I'm on the go, and again, I can't lay all my papers out, I will then be able to read on my phone. And that's not optimal, but it's something I really like to do. If I just have some time to kill, I can get some studying done. And to finish off, I want to talk about how I take my notes electronically, and then that'll be it for today. For electronic notes, I have two methods of taking electronic notes. From my phone, I have a Samsung Note 8, and I find that is an extremely effective way for me to take notes. It has a pen, and I can actually write out my notes, and then it will transfer those notes or those words. I'll write out what I have to write, and it will translate those words into text after reading my handwriting. And again, I really like to write my notes out, so I find this is really effective. And the nice thing is I always have my phone on me, so whenever I'm just walking around, I'll just write out little notes on my phone to make sure that I can remember them. I use the S Note. because I find that that is much more effective than the Samsung Notes that comes with the phone. And it is extremely useful note-taking software. I can draw graphs. I can do whatever. I can take pictures of things and write on them, resize them, make new notebooks, put a bunch of different notes together. And it is a very powerful note-taking software. If you have a Samsung Note, any version of them that has the S Note, I would definitely suggest that. It is. I can't overstate how effective of a note-taking software it is. I like it much better than Evernote because I can use the pen more effectively. I can draw and anything that I want to do. And it also does link with Evernote. And that's what I find is really effective. If you can't use that, and what I like to do sometimes for school, definitely for the podcast, because I type out my podcasts, is I'll then use Evernote. And it's a very effective way, I find, to take notes electronically, and then I can go back and look at them wherever I need to be. And I really like having the notebook feature and putting things together that way. And the nice thing about that also is the fact that S Note uploads to that. So it just makes sense for me to continue to get everything to seamlessly work together if I use Evernote. And I write almost everything else on there. If I have to write, I'll outline things on there. And that is what I find to be the most effective way for me to use Evernote. I'll use it as an outline tool, or I'll use it as a way for me to link my S Notes that way. And that's the way I will take most of my notes for school. And then when it comes to studying, if I've transferred all of them into Evernote or Rocketbook, I will then print them out sometimes, depending on how many notes there are for that exam. I'll then print them out and again, try to stick to the physical method as much as possible for when it comes to reading them, because I find that it really works for me in clearing my headspace. All right. And that is it for today. I know that was a lot about notes and how I take my notes and studying effectively, but I thank you everybody who tuned in today. I really appreciate it. Check out the Refresher Friday coming up this Friday. And again, I'm really glad that I was able to go over this, and it'll definitely be a way for me to keep myself accountable now that I've put it out there and make sure that I study more effectively going into finals. All right, everybody. Thank you. Kill it the rest of the week. Be effective. Be optimal. All right. Thank you. Love you guys. Bye.